It's well accepted now that the value of flipped learning is not so much the videos, but it's about the group space. It's about how students are actively involved in learning in the group space to practice and deepen their knowledge and generate and test hypotheses. In so saying that though, it's important for the video learning to be as effective as possible to ensure that the group learning is as effective as possible. There's two theoretical frameworks that underpin video learning. The first one is called the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And that theory has been developed by Mayer. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning is based on three assumptions. Firstly, the fact that we have two channels in which that we can gain information for learning. Ears and eyes are two channels in which we can receive information. The second assumption is that both of those channels are limited in their capacity. And the third principle is that learning is an active process that requires identifying and selecting information for it then to be integrated and processed. So learning is an active process. The second theoretical framework that's relevant here is called cognitive load theory. And cognitive load theory is by Sweller. Cognitive load theory essentially is what's related here to this limited capacity that Mayer talks about in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Essentially, his second assumption is based on cognitive load theory, and that is that the brain has a limited capacity, processing capacity for learning. And if the cognitive load is too high, then effective learning will not occur. Sweller says there's three different types of cognitive load. The first one is called the intrinsic load, and that is associated with the complexity of the information or the concept being learnt. And an example that he gives is that a student learning vocabulary for a foreign language is not necessarily a very high intrinsic load, because there's no interconnectedness of concepts, it's just learning words. However, learning to conjugate verbs and form sentences with those words, that has a higher intrinsic cognitive load because there's more interconnectedness between the parts. The next type of cognitive load is called extraneous cognitive load. And that, by being extraneous, it means that it's information that is not, or doesn't add value, or doesn't contribute to the learning of the task. It's extra, it's extraneous, and it adds to the cognitive load, but it doesn't add any value to the actual learning. The third type is called germane load. Now, this is actually a positive cognitive load. It's actually that processing, the processing, the thought processing power of the brain to actually create those memories. The germane load is what is left over after the intrinsic and the extraneous loads. So what we want to try and do with learning experiences is to remove the extraneous, or reduce the extraneous cognitive load to maximize the germane load, maximize the reserve cognitive capacity required for learning to occur. So how do we remove these extraneous cognitive loads? Well, we do that through a series of principles that Mayer has identified and tested extensively in labs, and these are called the principles of multimedia learning. So I'm going to talk you through these principles of multimedia learning and reinforce that they're all focused essentially on reducing the extraneous load, but also calling on this idea of the dual channels as well. So the first principle is called the multimedia principle. And that just reinforces this idea of dual channels. Because we've got two channels, audition and vision, well, information should be presented in those two channels, in multimedia. The second principle is called modality. The modality principle, and that essentially says that words should be spoken and not written. So on the screen, words should be spoken and not written. Now, this has been demonstrated in the lab. However, a number of studies that have been tried to replicate the modality principle in authentic learning environments, that is classrooms, haven't been able to demonstrate it. So there's actually a question mark about how important the modality principle is in authentic classroom environments. So the next principle is called the coherence principle. And that says that any extraneous information that doesn't contribute to the learning goal should be eliminated, because any additional information adds to the extraneous cognitive load and it doesn't add value to the learning, so it should be removed. The next principle is called contiguity. There's two types of contiguity, temporal and spatial. And what it's saying is that linked concepts and information need to be close together, spatially on the screen and also temporally throughout the video. So a classic example that we often see is a diagram of the brain and labels. So if this was had good spatial contiguity, we would have the label for the frontal lobe here and the label for the occipital lobe here, as opposed to a number 1 here with a 1 occipital down here and a key. That wouldn't have that same sort of spatial contiguity. So contiguity is about having linked principles, linked information close together. The next one we've got is signaling. And signaling is bringing the viewer's attention to something that's really important through underlining and highlighting and gesturing and pointing. And the next one is segmenting. And the segmenting principle basically just says to have to put learning into small chunks. So, you know, one video per concept and keeping the videos short. So this is not all of the principles of multimedia learning, but this is most of the important ones. And you can see how they relate to cognitive load theory, and you can see how they relate to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So coherence and contiguity and signaling and segmenting are all about reducing the extraneous cognitive load to increase the capacity for learning. So in a future video, I'm going to talk about different video types and how they meet the principles of multimedia learning, and therefore how effectively they're able to assist with having effective video learning.